If a hero falls and is met with disrespect, will you remain silent, or will you stand up to defend their honor? Barron Trump made a choice that left everyone stunned, on a flight that would never be forgotten. Flight 855 to Miami had begun boarding. Passengers shuffled down the aisles, stowing their luggage and adjusting their seats amidst the usual pre-flight bustle. As the crew hurried to prepare for the upcoming journey, they suddenly paused from outside. Through the small windows, beside the aircraft on the runway, a black hearse had stopped. A solemn honor guard unfurled the American flag, carefully draping it over a casket. Inside the plane, the atmosphere stilled for a moment as some passengers realized what was happening. A crew member gently announced over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will experience a slight delay to honor a fallen soldier, whose remains are being brought to their final resting place in Miami." The gravity of the moment was not lost on most, but not everyone shared in the reverence. A man in a sharply pressed suit scoffed and muttered, "This is ridiculous. We have a schedule to follow." A young woman nearby joined in, saying, "We have things to do. Why couldn't they do this after we leave?" Their words cut through the silence like a blade, making uncomfortable glances flicker between rows of seats. A few passengers clearly appeared uneasy, others exchanged disapproving looks. A mother pulled her young daughter closer, shielding her from the harsh words. Outside, the honor guard stood rigidly, their slow, deliberate movements exuding reverence as they carried the casket up the cargo ramp. But inside the cabin, the tension was mounting. No one knew that at the back of the plane, a young man was about to intervene, completely altering the course of the story. Inside the cabin, things felt unusual. The overhead bins clicked shut. Seatbelt latches snapped into place as the flight attendants moved with practiced urgency, striving to keep things running smoothly. Outside, the honor guard approached the aircraft door, carefully placing the flag-draped casket into the cargo hold. Sitting near the middle of the cabin, the man in the suit leaned back in his seat, sighing dramatically. "This is taking way too long," he muttered loudly enough for others to hear. His impatience seemed to ignite a spark in others. A woman seated a couple of rows behind spoke softly. "What's the big deal? Doesn't that soldier know we're waiting?" A wave of irritation rippled through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, some looking down at their phones, as if trying to avoid the moment. An elderly woman by the window dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, whispering to the man beside her, "That could be my grandson." At the back of the plane, a tall young man sat silently, almost unnoticed until now. And though his face might have been familiar to some, he was not drawing attention to himself. Dressed in a dark jacket, Barron leaned forward slightly, his brows furrowed. He was not among the main group of passengers boarding the plane. He had entered quietly with his security detail, choosing the back seat, staying away from the crowd. Unlike many others, he didn't look at his phone or fiddle with his belongings. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the small window where the honor guard completed their task with the respect and reverence it deserved. But the murmurs of discontent were growing louder, and Barron knew that this moment demanded more than silence. The complaints grew more pronounced, the tension rising throughout the cabin. A man seated a few rows ahead stood up and turned to speak to the flight attendant. "Excuse me, but I have a connecting flight. How much longer is this going to take?" His voice was not only impatient but tinged with contempt. Without missing a beat, the flight attendant calmly replied, "Sir, this process will only take a few more minutes. We appreciate your patience as we honor a fallen soldier." The words seemed to have no effect on the man. He sneered, sat back down, and muttered something under his breath. A few passengers around him smirked in agreement, exchanging looks as if the delay were a personal affront. The woman who had spoken earlier chimed in again, her voice sharp. "This is why airlines are such a mess. They pander to these over-the-top gestures instead of sticking to the schedule." As if the disrespect only grew, encouraging others who shared the same sentiment. The cabin, which had been silent and dignified, now buzzed with murmurs of discontent. A veteran sitting near the front of the plane stiffened in his seat, his jaw clenched, but he remained silent. The elderly woman by the window gripped her handkerchief tightly, shaking her head. Barron continued to observe from the back rows. He glanced at his security detail sitting a few rows ahead, their faces impassive. But Barron's face darkened. His eyes swept over the discontented passengers, and reflected in the window was the honor guard, still carrying out their duty with absolute solemnity. When the final disrespectful words echoed through the cabin, Barron made a decision that would change the entire atmosphere. Inside the plane, the unease spread, whispers of frustration weaving through the rows. But at the back of the plane, Barron Trump leaned forward, his tall frame casting a shadow over the seat in front of him. His presence, once almost invisible, began to shift. He stood slowly, each movement calm but purposeful. His height, over 6 feet, caught the attention of a nearby passenger, and recognition quickly spread. The whisper is that Barron Trump rippled through the cabin, blending with the sounds of impatience. Barron cleared his throat, not loudly, but enough to cut through the noise. His voice was steady and firm, immediately drawing everyone's attention. "Excuse me," he began, his tone calm but commanding. "I'd like to say something." The whispers immediately stopped. All eyes turned to him. The passengers who had previously shown their displeasure now looked uneasy. Even the man in the suit, the loudest among them, turned, his eyes wary. "I understand that everyone is in a hurry," Barron continued, his hand resting on the back of the seat in front of him. "But the casket down there belongs to someone who sacrificed everything for this country. Someone who gave up their schedule, their future, and their life so that we can enjoy the freedoms we have." His words resonated throughout the space, each syllable clear, each pause deliberate. The cabin became completely silent, the only sound the hum of the airplane's engine. But Barron was not done. He had more to say, something that would leave a deep mark on everyone present. Barron's gaze swept across the cabin, meeting the eyes of each passenger. "You don't need to know their name or their story," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What matters is the respect they deserve, not only for their sacrifice but for the countless sacrifices made by people like them." His words carried a weight that silenced even the most impatient passengers. The man in the suit couldn't bring himself to look Barron in the eye, and the young woman beside him blushed deeply, her gaze shifting away from the eyes around her. Barron continued, his voice softening but not losing its firmness. "I think we can all spare a few minutes to honor someone who can no longer speak for themselves. They've sacrificed more than any of us have in these few minutes of waiting." The flight crew exchanged looks of emotion. Even the veteran near the front of the plane, who had remained silent from the start, turned slightly, his gaze softening. And then, in an unexpected act, Barron did something that stunned everyone. He took a small American flag from his carry-on bag, holding it carefully in his hands. He stepped into the aisle and placed the flag on the empty seat by the window, just above where the casket rested below. "This seat belongs to them," he said simply, then stepped back. His words echoed with a reverence almost sacred, and that simple gesture spoke more than any words could. But what happened next was something no one, not even Barron, could have predicted. The cabin held its breath. Barron's action spread through the space, leaving no room for any further complaints. For a moment, no one moved or said a word. The flag resting on the empty seat became a symbol, clear and undeniable to all, impossible to ignore. The veteran near the front stood up, his movement slow but full of meaning. "Son," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you for reminding us what really matters." He nodded at Barron, placing a hand over his chest. Others began to follow suit, standing or sitting upright, their hands also placed over their hearts. The man in the suit, the loudest one earlier, looked around the cabin, now only seeing solemn faces. His smugness dissolved under the weight of the moment. I didn't mean to be disrespectful," he stammered, his voice now barely a whisper. The young woman beside him flushed with embarrassment, her previous frustration replaced by a clear sense of guilt. But it wasn't just shame that filled the cabin. Something deeper was happening. A teenager in a hoodie, sitting quietly by the window, took off his headphones and muttered, That's really cool," his voice full of newfound respect. A mother whispered something to her child. The child looked at Barron with wide, curious eyes. The flight crew, moved by the scene unfolding, moved with great dignity as they completed the final preparations for the flight. One of the flight attendants approached Barron, her voice soft as she said, "Thank you for doing that. It means more than you might realize." As the plane began to taxi down the runway, another wave of emotion spread across the passengers, marking this moment in their minds forever. As the plane rolled forward, a solemn atmosphere filled the cabin. Passengers sat in quiet contemplation, the impatience from earlier replaced by silent reflection. Outside the window, the honor guard raised their hands in salute as the plane began to move, their figures standing firm against the backdrop of the setting sun. Mid-flight, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your patience earlier. Today we are carrying the remains of a soldier who made the ultimate sacrifice. It is a great honor to bring them home. Please take a moment of silence to reflect and pay your respects." The entire cabin obeyed immediately without hesitation. Heads bowed, hands clasped, eyes closed. It was as though everyone on board felt the weight of the moment in their own way. The man in the suit, who had loudly complained earlier, clenched his fists, his expression deep in thought. The young woman who had been with him quietly wiped tears from the corner of her eye. Barron remained seated in the back rows, his eyes fixed on the objective. He wasn't seeking recognition or thanks. His intent had always been simple, to remind everyone of the value of respect and sacrifice. His security detail exchanged subtle glances, silently acknowledging the young man's calmness with a quiet pride. When the plane landed in Miami, the passengers remained seated as instructed by the crew. No one rushed to leave their seats. Instead, they watched the honor guard as they carefully removed the casket from the plane, standing tall and dignified as they carried it off. A round of applause began, soft at first, but soon growing into something strong and unified. Barron did not clap. Instead, he placed his hand over his chest, a small gesture, but one with profound meaning, leaving a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. As the passengers disembarked, they carried with them more than just their luggage. They carried a newfound awareness of the importance of honoring and remembering. The atmosphere when leaving the plane was entirely different from when they had boarded. The impatience and frustration had disappeared, replaced by a quiet stillness, full of contemplation. Some passengers exchanged soft words with the crew. Others nodded to Barron as they passed, their gazes filled with gratitude and respect. The man in the suit stopped near the exit, turned back to look at Barron. He hesitated, then said, "You were right. I needed that reminder." Barron simply nodded, his face calm but resolute. The young woman followed behind, whispering a sincere thank you. Outside on the tarmac, the honor guard loaded the casket into the waiting hearse. A small group of onlookers raised their hands in salute, among them the grieving family of the soldier, their faces etched with sorrow but also filled with pride. Many passengers who had been strangers only moments ago now stood together by the airport windows, watching the scene unfold. In that moment, they were no longer tourists, business people, or tired travelers. They were witnesses to a collective reminder of sacrifice and unity. Barron quietly left the terminal with his security detail, looking back once more, watching the people standing side by side, moved by the power of a small act. A soldier had fallen, and this was not just their story. It was a story about respect and the importance of it. Respect for those who gave everything, and respect for moments that deserve our attention, no matter how inconvenient they may seem. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to reflect on whether there is anyone in your life who has made a sacrifice for you, beyond the heroes who give everything for everyone. Sacrifice may seem small in the everyday moments, but if someone has done it for you, cherish them every minute. Let's spread the lesson of humility and gratitude, one small gesture at a time. And don't forget to share this message. It's something the world needs to hear. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love for you to share its message by liking and sharing it with your friends. Help us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers. It means the world to us and allows us to create more meaningful stories for you. Don't forget to share your thoughts about the story and let us know which city you're watching from. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in our next story.